Thank you all for joining us this evening. We look forward to engaging in a conversation here on the panel, and then we'll have an opportunity to bring some of you into the conversation as well as we get into this topic. The clever and creative title for this session, and credit to the titling team, was Cliques and Kalashnikovs. And in essence, what that is evocative of is the fact that we're talking about an online experience and an offline repercussions. The nature of online and offline conduct is increasingly being blurred, with offline conduct influencing online rhetoric and speech, and certainly the prospect that online content can have offline consequences. And so what we'll do here is I'm just going to briefly introduce our panelists and then give each of them an opportunity to succinctly introduce themselves and provide a little bit more context about how they approach these issues. First, we have Erin Saltman, who's a policy manager in the EMEA counter-terrorism and CVE for Facebook. Mariam Safi, immediately to my right, who's the founding director of DROPS, which is a leading think tank in Afghanistan. Next to Mariam is Shiv Sahai, who's the Joint Secretary of the National Security Council. I'd already introduced Erin, who's there in the middle. Knut Dorman, who's the head of the legal division at the ICRC. And Chris Felton, who is the Deputy Director of the Joint International Counter-Terrorism Unit from the UK. So what I would do here is maybe I'll start all the way at the end with you, Chris, and give you an opportunity to provide a little bit of context around your approach and how you think about the issue.
Thank you very much, Colin. Very briefly, the main reasons why this is such an important issue for us is linked to the 5 terrorist attacks that we had in 2017 in the UK. And in each of those attacks, we found that there was an online element in each of those attacks. And while they weren't purely online, it was an important part in each of those attacks to differing respects. So the things that we really focus on, the things we try to tackle in looking at this issue is, first of all, trying to make preventative use of the internet a core part of broader strategies. Broader counter-terrorism strategy, part of our broader strategies in dealing with online harms, and also broader in terms of our strategy for working in overseas on counter-terrorism. The other thing which I really wanted to stress right up front is that the UK approach to this area is around dealing with all types of terrorism. So the attacks in 2017, 4 of them were Islamicist terrorist attacks, 1 of them was extreme right wing. But within context, the risk around extreme right wing is a growing area, particularly in terms of extreme right wing terrorism, and so the way that we talk about this, the way that we think about it, considers that as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. We'll go now to Knut.
Good evening, everybody. I'm a representative of the International Committee of the Red Cross, and this will certainly give you then also quite some guidance with regard to the approach that we are going to take. The International Committee of the Red Cross, as you may know, is an impartial humanitarian organization, a frontline emergency response organization, which really sees on a daily basis the impact of terrorist attacks and also the impact of counter-terrorism strategies that are being developed and that have also a bearing and a human toll on the people living under the control of terrorist organizations. So our aim is really to bring to the attention, well, first of all, to influence on the ground the proper behavior, to bring down the human toll for civilians. The other aspects that are equally important to us, each time when new counter-terrorism strategies have been developed, there were quite a host of legal challenges that have been posed. Different legal regimes have been applied, blurring of lines has happened, and they are quite clearly, we had to take then a stance as well in this respect. And finally, and this is certainly also very important when we look at the online part, we certainly have to acknowledge that the online part is a very strong tool of influencing, and we certainly have to see what it means for our strategies to influence then actors to facilitate, or first of all to accord to the basic principles of humanity, but then also to facilitate humanitarian action on the ground.
Thank you, Knut. Aaron?
Hi. Well, firstly, it's always a pleasure to be somewhere in person. It's always better to be at the table, part of a discussion, than hearing about it or not being able to engage directly. And as Facebook, I mean, I don't have a light, fluffy job at Facebook. So people like Colin and myself, we're not the ones that can turn your face into a unicorn or do the really cute functionalities. We're literally on teams that deal with some of the really hard, difficult gray area problems. So my entire team is around counter-terrorism and dangerous organizations. So everything from white supremacy neo-Nazis to Islamist extremist jihadists. And when we talk about terrorism, that looks very different in different parts of the world. So when we're having to approach it as a social media company, realizing that over 85% of our user base is outside of the US and Canada, speaking in a myriad of different languages, we need to have very localized ground truths. We need to be making connections with NGO sectors, talking with governments, talking with other tech sectors. And part of what my team does is also look for the solves. So where is it a black and white issue where we need to remove content? That's about takedowns, that's about machine learning, artificial intelligence, but also paired with the human expertise to understand it. And then where is it a question of a gray area? When we talk about extremism, what does that mean? When is it an issue of trying to upscale civil society voices to challenge that instead of a question of taking down content? So none of these are easy topics, but only by engaging and creating partnerships can you even get close to having the right solutions.
Thank you, Aaron. Shiv?
I'm Shiv Sahai, the Additional Secretary in the National Security Council in India. My career has been largely as a police officer in the state of Jammu and Kashmir. I've seen terrorism at very close quarters from the beginning of my career till now. I've seen it offline. I've seen it when the internet was introduced. I've seen the impact it has created. And when I look across what happened when I started and now where we are, some things have changed and many things have not. And I think that is where we need to understand that how important has the internet and social media been, but also the impact, whether it's confined to the social media or whether it's offline.
Thank you. Miriam?
Thank you, Colin. Our organization, DROPS, as a research organization, one of our aims is to be able to help a government like the one in Afghanistan that is transitioning from conflict to peace by providing it with evidence-based knowledge that can help it make better informed strategies and decisions and policies. In that light, of course, the concept of both online and offline counterterrorism is both a component of work that the NSA in Afghanistan works on, and it's also one of the areas that we try to facilitate with the flux of information. One of the things that policymakers have consistently mentioned to us is the dearth of evidence-based research on counter-narrative CT-related issues. And with this dearth of evidence in Afghanistan, there are difficulties in identifying what are the structural issues that are pushing and pulling recruits, for example. There is macro-level knowledge, but there is no micro-level knowledge on the processes that are involved, the multidimensional processes involved in recruitment. For that reason, we started working on this particular area for the past 3 years in Afghanistan to try to see if we are able to identify micro-level based indicators that can help policymakers in Afghanistan develop a more holistic and comprehensive CT and CVE strategy.
Thank you, Miriam. I appreciate the synopsis from each of you about your perspective and how you think about this issue. The title of the panel is Clicks and Kalashnikovs, so I'm going to start on the clicks side and talk a little bit about social media and the online aspect of this. Coming from a Twitter perspective, I've been at the company some 7.5 years now and appreciate over time how the nature of terrorist use of social media and terrorist presence on the platform has changed and adjusted. So if we go back over the last 3 years in our reporting of our terrorist content track record, I think we've removed some 1.4 million accounts on Twitter over that time. But importantly, 3.5 years ago, when we were removing those accounts, about 25% of the accounts that we removed were flagged using technology. And 75% of those accounts were reported by users. So that was an incredibly large percentage where the burden to report came from users themselves, and 25% were identified using technology. In the last reporting period, that percentage is now 91% of the accounts we remove are flagged using technology. So that's an investment in machine learning that is paying dividends for us on the platform as we identify those accounts. But more amazingly, of the 91% identified using technology, over 75% of those are removed before they can do their first tweet. So that's a significant investment that starts to suffocate the oxygen of these entities online, and as they're knocked down and try to resuscitate and come back, we're identifying them more readily and quickly addressing those. But Erin, I wanted to talk to you because obviously social media gets invoked a lot in this area as a hotbed of fomenting content, either from FTOs specifically or violent extremist groups generally. And in that context, maybe talk a little bit about how the industry approaches it collectively, because while Twitter and Facebook and YouTube and others may vigorously compete commercially in the marketplace, this is one area where we don't compete but actually seek to collaborate. But talk a little bit about the approach of the industry and Facebook in particular.
Yeah, I think it's a really important question, because what we realize is we do have limitations. We have so much knowledge about what goes on our platforms. We have very little knowledge inherently as soon as it leaves our platform. And this is where we're always going to be just part of the puzzle. And so we know we have an onus on what does come onto our platforms, and we definitely have responsibility. What we have found is that the better that we get, there are also some unintended consequences, and that maybe the threat shifts. So, as you mentioned, in the last couple of years, all of our bigger platforms have increased human resources substantially. I can tell you I'm on a phone call every single week with Microsoft, YouTube, and Twitter, just to talk about terrorism and dangerous organizations. And we're looking at things like photo and video matching technology, and how once we know about a piece of terrorist propaganda, every single subsequent upload is caught before it even hits the platform. Or you mentioned recidivism. Once we know of a bad actor, it's harder and harder for them to recreate an account because of all the different ways algorithms and artificial intelligence can see that that's the same person. Or fanning out. So when you look at processes of radicalization offline, which is the traditional way that radicalization has taken place, it really is not in a silo. It's really not, the lone wolf phenomena is a very rare thing. And we see that this is a very social structure. And social networks are primed to facilitate that in a way. So when we look at that process, we know that it's usually not in isolation, and we can do network analysis, what we call fanning out. So that if an account does come down because of sharing terrorist propaganda, we can look for similar indicators. Who was part of the same group? Were they talking a lot? And we saw similar types of content being shared. So we can surface a small group and triage it to human teams. But it has to be a combination of this machine learning as well as humans. So machine learning is not very good at nuance, and sometimes humans aren't even that good at nuance. So we need to have a lot of oversight and cultural understanding. Terrorist content's very different than other types of abuse areas. So child exploitation imagery is illegal to share no matter what. But terrorist content gets shared by mainstream media sometimes to talk about an incident, or by activists to condemn it, and we don't want to over-censor those voices that are very crucial to push back on something. As we get better at things like taking down content, so in 2018 we took down 14.3 million pieces of terrorist content, just in the first 3 quarters of last year. That's not because there was a huge spike of terrorists entering. It's actually because our machine learning got better at going back in time to clean up content that might have been posted 5 or 6 years ago. So numbers alone are also misleading. We need the context around those numbers. But the better that we get, it doesn't mean that we've actually put a human in jail. We are not actually the government, despite what some people might think. We don't. So when a profile comes down, that doesn't mean the individual has disappeared. It means they proliferate. They either try to come back on successfully or not, or they migrate to another platform. So I'm sure nobody in this room has just one app on their phone, and bad actors are the same. So you use different apps for different things. And what we're seeing increasingly is the better that the big companies get at pushing, the more we'll see a migration to smaller, less regulated platforms that maybe don't have the support. And that's the reason that we founded the Global Internet Forum to Counter-Terrorism, to work with other platforms. And in some respect, that's where can we share technology. So photo and video matching, we share with about 13 different companies. We have a database of over 100,000 unique pieces of content in there. And then how do we talk about things like terms of service or ways to prevent terrorist exploitation? So we're seeing unintended consequences from the best of our efforts, realizing we still have more to do just on our own platforms, but also creating an infrastructure to bring other platforms into knowledge and open the door to have better structured dialogue with other sectors. So it's not just Facebook talking to one government and Twitter talking to one NGO, but actually bringing different NGOs and different governments to talk with us at the same time so that we're not doing overlapping concentric circles.
Yeah, thank you, Erin. And certainly, as you mentioned, when Facebook and Twitter and YouTube address content on the platform, there is definitely a sense that there's a migration to other parts of the internet, other internet apps, the so-called dark web, which is more difficult to monitor and to see, perhaps. That's definitely something that we're there. I'd like to go to Chris and then to Shiv to get a little bit deeper into the government perspective. And to appreciate how the government responds to this. Because obviously, technology is always changing, and the march of technology is inexorable. And so how does a government keep pace with the rapidity of change? And how does the government deal with the balance that governments always have to try to strike in a democracy with respect to that balance between addressing content for purposes of safety and security, while at the same time ensuring that important values like free expression and views of perhaps minority viewpoints are protected?
So coming to the, well, I'll deal with the first point first because it's relatively more straightforward in that I think that's around having the effective dialogue with industry and understanding that industry is best placed to understand how technology is changing. The role for government is to make sure we've got the dialogue with industry and that we're able to link into that expertise and to develop the approaches that we have, legislative oversight and approaches in that way, and the independent oversight, which there is also in the UK system, speaking from a very parochial perspective in that respect. So can you repeat this? Oh, the second question was around how we balance out the rights of minorities. So the first thing to say is that the UK government is absolutely committed to an open, free internet. It is one of the things which we are committed to in the same way as the ability of the internet to operate safely and securely and to enable people who are vulnerable to radicalising influences to be protected from those who would wish to radicalise them. From a preventing terrorist use of the internet perspective, the definition of what needs to be referred and removed by industry is set out in legislation. The 2000 Terrorism Act, as it's been amended, sets out what is defined as terrorism, and it's relatively clear-cut in most cases. One thing which I will mention is that some of the slightly more tricky areas, but ones which are still captured under legal definition, are those bits of material which aren't violent, but which still contravene legislation in terms of promoting terrorist activity. So videos demonstrating how allegedly wonderful life was in the caliphate in Syria isn't necessarily violent, but it falls foul of legislation in terms of preventing promotion of terrorism. So that's the way we try to balance it. And of course, in a parliamentary system, any type of legal measures that are put in place, we have a new bill being has been introduced into the Houses of Parliament, is subject to extremely strict parliamentary oversight as well.
Thank you, Chris. And Shiv, as you approach this, obviously government has a relationship with the citizenry, has relationships in the community, is trying to deal with safety and security issues. And as you think about it, how do you address issues where you're trying to deal with the susceptibility of somebody who might be vulnerable to content that leads them down a path towards radicalization, or induces or provokes violence, and win over the hearts and minds of that community?
Well, foremost we must understand what the cyberspace is about, because the cyberspace is something that we have got land, air, sea.
I think you have to hold the mic a little. Hold it like a rapper.
Okay, so what I was saying was that cyberspace is something that humanity has created for itself. You've had land, you've had air, you've had sea, and you've got space. But those are natural phenomena. Cyberspace is something that we have created. And in cyberspace, it is for us to govern and understand how to use the space. Because this space has been created by technology companies, there has to be a collaboration between the people who created the space, the people who use the space, and the people who need to govern the space. So there has to be a collaboration between society and the industry, as well as government. Now, when you talk about content and what comes onto it, we have to understand that content online content in itself has no importance unless it is read in relationship to what is offline. So what you do offline is going to influence your what's going to happen online. And if you take, for example, there are very few cases where people have actually radicalized online who have actually created acts of terror. Most of them are people who were radicalized offline, who only got more traction online and then became more attuned to violence. So I think that is a relationship that needs to be understood very clearly. And that is where I think the technology companies need to play an important role. Because how do you define what is going to create a problem? And I think that is where this confusion needs to end. What is it that is going to create violence? So if in the garb of human rights, if you're going to say that this content is acceptable because it's dissident content, fair enough. But every community, every country has got its own context. Something that may be extremist context, which may not get traction in other communities, could get traction in certain communities. So that is where the technology companies need to come into play and understand what is important, and therefore there needs to be a collaborative effort. That's, I think, primarily one of the things that we need to work on. Statistics about how much content has been pulled down and 1.9 million posts were pulled down, whatever. The statistics vary from place to place. The issue is that if about 100 posts are put onto the site, are pulled down, They again put onto the site and again pull down. If 100 posts are put down 100 times, it's 1,000 posts that have been pulled down. Statistically, it looks very good, but actually those 100 posts continue to remain on the web. So in effect, the content has actually never gone off. So I think those things need to be worked out when we talk in terms of how the content is going to impact society. So these are some of the things that beyond optics, beyond trying to convince people that you are sincere, I think the real sincerity lies in the fact is that the confusion around what is content needs to end.
Thank you, Shiv. And certainly, to the extent to which the online companies are playing whack-a-mole and knocking down the bad stuff in repetitive fashion that keeps coming back or remains present, I think it demonstrates some underlying intent by certain actors to continue to post that. One of the questions goes to how do you also deal with that, as you mentioned, offline radicalization and the offline underlying environment that people are living in that might induce them down a path that then may be triggered or encouraged, fostered in some way through their online exposure to content. So Mariam, I want to talk to you next and get your views, because obviously coming from Afghanistan, you're coming from a place that is on, as you mentioned in your opening, on this migratory path from conflict to hopefully peace and enduring peace and prosperity. But how does the liberal state, from your perspective, balance the policing aspect through community policing, through laws with respect to safety and security, and individual freedoms and individual rights in the context you're most familiar with?
Actually, I'm going to take this question and look at it from more of a wider context than just Afghanistan, because it does not apply so much in the context of Afghanistan at the present moment. And the question is, can the liberal state actually be bold enough to have this conversation on human rights and freedom of expression? As we see it, it currently shies away from this conversation in the name of surveillance for national security. But if the state shows true courage to have a discussion on freedom of expression and human rights, then a framework can be created where this will not lead to the abuses of these very same rights, while countering terrorist messaging, narratives, and content. But right now, none of the states that we can see have shown the true full courage to do that. What we need is a sort of moral reimagination of what democracy means to us now. The old notions of liberal democracy do not hold the same value as they once did, because our notions of how we experience democracy has changed. The state has become multi-layered. We still experience physical territory in the same manner. However, intellectually, that space has now become without any boundaries due to the internet. So within this context, we need to think and have a discourse of what liberal democratic principles means to us now, and which ones are we all willing to uphold, and which ones do we all have a similar perspective in view on, taking into consideration our society and our context, and then talk about the protection of freedom of rights and expressions once we have those structures, those governance structures in place to enable us to have the discourse.
And what do you think should be the guide there? Should this be international human rights law, or through what prism do you look at sort of global standards that you then have to drill down to take into account local context?
This would, in my opinion, this would be a very, a global discourse on liberal democracy. And as we have seen in the past 3 days, we are talking about a new reorder And within the conversations that we have had in these last 3 days, we consistently hear that this is more prevalent now in our context than ever before. So it has to most definitely happen at the global level and then trickle down to countries specific to their context and then trickle down further from that point onwards. But unless we start tackling that, unless we start addressing that notion, we cannot possibly find an answer to this question or even ask this question at this current juncture.
Knut, when you think about it from your perspective with a sort of leading NGO in this space, what are the expectations that the ICRC has towards governments regarding offline and online threats that are posed by non-state armed actors in the areas where ICRC functions?
Well, I should perhaps start by saying that probably when to put it a bit in perspective, I think we would probably still argue that the biggest challenges are still in the offline world, because that's exactly where, based on our field presence, we see the direct impact, the toll that civilian populations have to pay. That's pretty clear. We clearly have to add that the online dimension is an add-on, probably an amplifying factor that we have to take into account. So it means for us, if we strive to alleviate the suffering of populations, we have to be very worried about online discourses that go against the fundamentals of humanity. That's pretty clear. And how do we counter this? The online space is certainly also a big factor that can amplify grievances and then also generate reactions somewhere else. And this brings me a bit to the point, what are our expectations when states are developing strategies to counter terrorism, to fight extremist violence. And our starting point there is clearly to recognize that states have a legitimate concern to address these challenges. This is something, it's normal that states have to protect their populations and to ensure their security. However, what we also say is that these strategies must be developed in full compliance with the law. Because one thing that we have witnessed certainly as well is that violations that are being committed as part of counterterrorism strategies, and I would say it will be the same whether it is in the physical world or then also in the online world, this will lead to a spiral of violence, and their states have to be clear upon it. I think we were very, very much reassured when states, by consensus, in fact, adopted the global counterterrorism strategy at the General Assembly, where all states had agreed that when devising strategies against counterterrorism strategies, this has to be done in full compliance with the rule of law, and there in particular international humanitarian law and human rights law when it is applicable. It has also indicated, or states have indicated as well, that this applies in the online world. So there are also rights in the online world, and I think this is very important. Now for us the big challenge is, or what is important is that states also walk the talk and apply it, not just the words on the paper, but really do it. And some of the things that we have been witnessing, in particular in some recent times, was a discourse really at the highest level sometimes by politicians that led to dehumanization of the enemy. A discourse that in a way gives the impression that there are certain persons that are outside the law, outside of compassion, and outside of any protections. And this is certainly amplified through online means. And our call is really that there is moderation in discourse, and that states lead there also by example, because in our experience, this only leads to a spiral And the question is really, where does it end there? It is really the sentiment of us against the others, and this has to be addressed. What we have seen as well, it leads sometimes to exceptionalism. So because there is some perceived new threat, well, some of the limitations that were hard fought for over years are no more relevant because the other side is so bad. And again, we get into this cycle of violence, and this, we believe, is clearly also a source for added grievances, radicalisation that comes, and I think our call is there really, it's important that there are voices of moderation, and this is fully integrated.
Yeah, well, certainly, there have been instances where some armed groups are advocating violence and perpetrating acts of violence against international humanitarian law. And so how does the ICRC address issues like that?
Well, the first step for us clearly is to reiterate that these acts are simply unacceptable, reiterate the law, and this is the matter. There is certainly no alternative. The other point that is important to us, we clearly have to be aware that there are different types of non-state armed groups, and we should not judge all armed groups in the same way. There are definitely armed groups that can be influenced by different means. And perhaps it's of interest to you that the ICRC has been investing quite a bit in a research that wanted to get a sense as to what are factors that induce restraint, the so-called roots of restraint study that we have been doing. And one finding clearly was there that we have a diversity of different groups. One change that we observed that is quite big is we have still the very, let's say, vertically organized armed groups, where integration of the law, sanctions, and the like that we have been doing for quite some time has an impact on the behavior of these armed groups. On the other hand side, and this is perhaps the interesting thing when we look at the online set, we have more networked, more horizontally organized armed groups. But our findings were there as well that these, even though that the structures are more fluid, they are receptive also to influence. Perhaps much more than in an informal way. It is community pressure that comes. It is values that are there in addition to the law. And I think the big challenge is that an assessment is really being made how groups socialize restraint. How is this being done? And this is something where also the ICRC will have to learn. We have now a basis, an assessment, some evidence, and now it is to make use of it.
Thank you, Knut. I want to talk and just get the views of several panelists right now on something that Aaron had mentioned earlier, which is counterspeech. And just ask to what extent you think counterspeech is an effective tool, and to the extent to which you think it can be effective, who should the speaker be, and how do you animate and encourage that kind of counter-narrative if you believe it can be an effective antidote or an inoculation, perhaps, to build resilience in a community around this. Anybody want to take it first? Go ahead, Chris.
So I'm really grateful you asked that, because one of the things I just noted down was to talk about the positive. So I think one of the things that, certainly from a CT perspective, we think too much is that the internet is a dangerous thing that's providing bad people with lots of opportunities to do bad things. It is actually, in a mirror way, a good opportunity to amplify the ability to put out the counter message, the positive narratives, which can help to defeat or to help to counter the negative narratives that the terrorist groups would like to use. So we've got a team within the UK and the UK government called RICU, which is the Research Information Communications Unit. Hopefully I've got that right. A colleague from there is in the audience nodding, so hopefully I have got that right. And one of their jobs is around the development of those kind of positive narratives. In terms of where that message comes from, it's clearly much more effective if it doesn't come from government. I shall allow industry representatives to say whether they think it comes from industry very well. I think I know what the answer will be. But coming from community groups, from the ground, is where that is most effective. And what our role has been is around facilitating that and supporting it, because there's a lot of community groups out there who are already doing this. They're already in the position of providing positive messages about being the kind of reliable voices in the community, which can be amplified and facilitated through government support, but essentially it comes from them. And a really good example of that is after the bombing at Manchester Arena in 2017. There was a groundswell of positive messaging of community groups getting involved, being able to say this isn't what we stand for, this isn't Manchester, and that the types of online tools that had been developed by those groups were able to be used very quickly with the kind of narratives that could counter that. So hopefully that's a relatively
thank you. That's helpful. I'd love to get Shiv's perspective on counter-speech as a tool or counter-narrative and how you engage community-based organizations on that.
Well, I think one point that Mr. Felton mentioned was suspicion of government. And I think that's a very fundamental issue, because who's going to regulate? So government, that's the first thing that we have to get out of the way, and that is communities and people cannot be suspicious of government. Because that's a big challenge. I understand, and we all understand, that what has been happened with the information age is that government has become suspicious. It's a global phenomenon. And most of the time when you're talking about content and counter-content, everybody says, don't get the government involved. But at the end of the day, who's going to protect the citizen? Who is going to look after the rights of the citizen? It ultimately will be the responsibility of the government, and therefore the government must be involved. Now, whether it takes time to use society to get credibility and be able to govern the space, that's one part. But the fact is that I think one of the reasons that the government is not being allowed to get into this space by creating this kind of, what should I say, impression that government's intervention will be negative, I think that needs to be resolved first and foremost. Now, talking about content online, yes, it has to be in line with what has been your offline activity. And that is where I would like to talk about what India's experience has been. We host, in the context of Islamic terrorism, we host the world's second largest, now maybe perhaps the third largest Muslim population. But our subscription to the ISIS has been minimal. And there is reason for that. Because in our country, the religion, Islam, was in keeping with the very syncretic culture that India has evolved with all religions. Plus, I think our democratic institutions, our judiciary, and the ability of our system to be able to cater for the aspirational deficit that does occur with minorities in all societies has been fairly robust and fairly responsive. So therefore, there was been no need for people from this country to subscribe to anything that is outside. And I think that is a message offline, which has been more powerful than any message that we would like to put on online. So I think that is where we need to look at what messaging is there. There are other communities, there are other countries which have got their own context. But after having said this, I would like to remind people, and that is one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. And if states continue to use subconventional methods of warfare and use terrorism as an instrument of state policy, we are going nowhere. There has to be a global consensus on this issue fundamentally before we address anything offline or online.
Yeah, thank you. And that is a bit of an antiphon to what Mariam was talking about before, about the global norms and a global dialogue around what is the guiding and abiding philosophy around rights of individuals, rights of societies, because it's hard to exercise a lot of individual freedoms if you don't feel safe and secure in the first place. And I think that's something that is appreciated. Aaron, your comments and thoughts on counter-speech as a tool.
Yeah, I mean, I have a million, so I'll keep it to one or two. But my entire work before I came on board with Facebook was helping lots of different sectors in different parts of the world strategize what preventing and countering violent extremism looks like and feels like, and then trying to measure whether or not it is or is not effective. And I think, you know, we talk about radicalization online, and there's this automatic assumption that the propaganda radicalizes. And yet there's this automatic assumption that counter-propaganda does nothing. And so it's funny to look at it, and there's a lot of bad terrorist propaganda online. I've seen lots of it. Still, I'm not fully radicalized. And there's a lot of bad counter-speech and attempts online as well by different sectors. So we need to actually see what works and why. Some of this is also connecting NGOs and activists on the ground with the skills to upskill and upscale their voice strategically. Sometimes that's also making sure that they're connected with creatives so that when they try to translate some of their offline work or amplify their voice online, it's in a way that actually hits their target audience. Oftentimes, amazing activists and NGOs are not natural online marketeers. They're not naturally knowing how to use the tools, and that's no fault of their own. That's not their line of work. So as tech companies, we can definitely provide training, infrastructure, ad credit, help. We should not be the one providing the message. We should not be the one telling a community what hate-based violence looks like in their community. We should not be defining that for civil society. But we should be working with them to identify what those grievances are. How do we cause natural resiliency against violent extremist recruitment or messaging? And then on the measurement side, we actually, on the online tooling, we skip a lot of time because we have instant metrics. Now, they're not always perfect, but things like measuring reach and engagement. If you're trying to get people to go onto an exit program or a hotline, measuring how many people actually go from the passive content into that other forum, measuring how much they're actually engaging with it. Do you have a strategy to turn that passive online engagement into a two-way dialogue? That's where extremists win. If you have a successful recruiter, they're turning a passive image or piece of propaganda into a two-way dialogue that turns into a very interpersonal discussion. And the best counter-speech does the same thing. So it's a question of what is your message, who is the messenger, and on what platform, whether online or offline, are you trying to convey that? And that's when you get better strategy. An example of how this has happened very successfully, you mentioned one example, Chris, but things like Bring Back Our Girls. How many people have heard of that campaign? And there's no reason you should have, because you've probably never been to that village. You don't know who those girls are. It's in a place you don't really understand. And yet the language was important. So it was Bring Back Our Girls. It was a communal language building. It was done in English to catch a larger global audience. And it was done by an amazing grassroots group of women in Nigeria who I've had the pleasure of talking with, and their fight still isn't over, but to put top-down pressure to help in what was a terrorist hostage scenario. So we have amazing examples where this can be very helpful, either by bringing government into the discourse or by countering and preventing the ideology from spreading further. So we have to do that locally, and even in India. So if our tech companies are engaging in India, we have to do it through our public policy leads that are here on the ground, and not assume that we have arrogance and think that if it works in Silicon Valley, it might work elsewhere, and realize and humble ourselves to the local expertise. So things like, I might call something the Online Civil Courage Initiative in Europe, which exists, but here we've called things Josh Talks or Voice Plus or the Digital Masala Challenge. So things have to be localized and allow the local expertise to flourish. So I think that's our role, is to upscale and upskill existing amazing efforts and bring them into the online space.
Great, thank you, Erin. I'm going to ask Mariam for her views on this, but just a forewarning that after she speaks, I'm going to kick it to the audience for questions. So if you have questions, you can start to get them ready. Mariam, here you go.
In the context of Afghanistan, and what I'm about to say, of course, very much applies to the global context of the challenges that counter-narrative strategy or concept approach is being faced with. And this ever so applies to our context in Afghanistan. It has, of course, gained widespread acceptance by the Afghan government, civil society organizations and practitioners alike. But what we are seeing missing in this is that there is, it's built on on shaky theoretical and also empirical foundation, as I was discussing earlier. Second, an important field is missing in this entire approach, and that is the tools and techniques of literary studies. Third, the emphasis on ideology, which assumes that indoctrination is the primary vehicle for radicalization. It leaves out all other well-evidenced explanation for behavioral change. And lastly, it pays little attention to the broader cultural dimensions of violent extremist narratives. And I just want to put a little bit more emphasis on this. In this context, what we need to do is we have to look at the cultural dimensions of violent extremism. We have to look inside a militant group. Within this, we might see a lot of artistic products and social practices. But since they often serve no time on the field, in the military field, they often go unrecognized and we don't give them the due attention they require. Some scholarship has evolved around this. For example, there is a there's a collection of poetry and ghazals by the Taliban, which has been published very recently. So this is, for example, as well as other literary works that is being ignored in our context when we're trying to look at the content and the form and the messaging that is being spread. And this is a huge mistake. It is impossible to understand their jihad without examining the culture behind it. And there's lots of various recommendations that can be given in this regard, but there's only one I want to emphasize here more than any, and that is that since there is no counter-narrative, there are multiple narratives. So a better strategy would be to flood public spaces with more content, which is of the great variety, not one-sided or the other. So this complicates the space and the conversation, and it dilutes the current binary narrative. So unless, oftentimes, for example, the Taliban use a storytelling method, as does various other terrorist organizations around the globe, in espousing their message. But the storytelling that they exude is one that is closed-ended. What we need to do is take that very same story, but open it. Take the story and engage the receiver with the space to dissect it and to come up with their own interpretations. So complicate the story, complicate the scenario, and get those that are receiving it to start thinking critically about what it is that's being given to them. Only then can we then see the development of new content and whatnot. And a second recommendation that I would pose here, particularly in our context, the main target of recruitment, social media content of the Taliban is not targeted towards Afghans. That's targeted towards Westerners. It's targeted towards those countries that have foreign troops in Afghanistan. And the way they target them through social media is to decrease their morale in support of their foreign forces in being in Afghanistan. And to that, the insurgency very well targets the gaps in the cleavages. You know, they make certain statements like the Americans have lost, for example, the Americans have lost the taste to continue the fight in Afghanistan. They no longer want to see their soldiers come back in coffins. This is the discourse right now in the United States, to leave out of Afghanistan, to bring about a political solution, because there is no military solution to this cause. And so one of the other ways that we can start to counter this is, and this has been happening in other parts, but not in Afghanistan, to my knowledge as of yet, media literacy for youth. Because the offline campaign of the insurgency does target Afghans, and it's male youth, unemployed male youth. So to be able to assess this demography, media literacy to enable youth to catch fake news and to discern between what is accurate and what is fake. And once that happens and the seed of critical thinking is sort of placed, then they can also start a discourse, and then that can also lead to, once again, new content, new information that can be produced.
Thank you, Mariam. This is very interesting and I think insightful comments there. I've always felt that the terminology that we often invoke here of counter-speech does invoke that binary oppositional notion of speech in direct opposition to what's there. And certainly not every community-based organization is prepared to stand and be directly oppositional and get in the grill of a terrorist organization and have a debate. So thinking of it as alternative narratives, I think is a very healthy way to do it. And I think your comments there at the end also with respect to media literacy and getting that into the course curricula of schools at a younger age, you know, certainly as a parent of teenagers myself, I know that the world they're growing up in is very different than the one I grew up in. And I know that we have to build not only the resiliency, but the savviness that informed citizens have to have with respect to the discernment they need to bring to content and messages that they receive from whatever source, offline and online. And I think that's important. Thank you for that. I'm going to kick it now to questions from the audience. There are microphones on each of the tables. What I would ask is that you raise your hand. I'll try to call on you. We'll do a few of these. If you could say your name and what organization you're from. I would like to give first dibs to a Raisina young fellow. If there's a Raisina young fellow who has a question, I want to give them a first crack at asking something. And if not, then we'll go to general audience members or people who would like to be Raisina young fellows. Anybody? No? Okay, right here.
Thank you so much. Suppose I would like to be a Raisina fellows. My name is Laura Yerikesheva. I'm from Kazakhstan, Institute of Oriental Studies. Thank you so much for very illuminating discussions. My question is to Erin Saltman. You're talking so nicely about the so-called hard part of this identifying the radical contents on internet. Like if there is a message, who is a messenger, and 100 times appearing and then spread it and so. My question is how to identify the so-called software or dimension of this as of this content, because we know sometimes the radicalization starts with this opposition to the government or the spiritual searches or some kind of social injustice as far as Islam is concerned. Social justice, one of the main important part of this religion. So how to identify this content? And second, briefly comment towards Sheikh Sahai and Mariam Safi, was just perfectly told about this is a culture-based dimension of any religions, and radicalization is the extreme narrowness of mind. So in this case, if we talk about Islam, for example, in Central Asia, there are so many Islams, so many ways of life. So there cannot be one normative type, because each of these depends and based on the cultural traditions. And so in this respect, when we are talking about these recepts or how to deal with this, I would say this is a culture-based traditional things. It maybe could be one of the best way to unlock the mind, as I said, and so go to broad the vision. And from this perspective, if we make attention to focus attention of the readers or users to these traditions related to cultural dimensions, and to see the other within the religion and outside religion, that could make us.
Thank you. We'll go to Erin, if you want to give an initial response, and then Mariam.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think that when you go back to the research on processes of radicalization, we're always dissecting pathways, and we're always dissecting push and pull factors. So what is making one person more vulnerable than another? Why did, out of 10 people at this school, this one left and then all their friends stayed and the parents are shocked? And we want to find one silver bullet. I've heard theories about absent father syndrome. I've heard theories about economic disenfranchisement. None of these actually get us to the right place. So we can identify lots of things that make someone vulnerable. We can identify social isolationism, so somebody feeling that their in-group is under attack. But ultimately, there are lots of groups that we could identify that have all of those grievances and are not violently mobilized. The Roma community in Europe. They are disenfranchised, they are considered an underclass, they have lots of racism towards them. They are not a terrorist mobilized group. What's most disappointing when you look at the majority of people that join violent extremist groups is the reason they joined are for very positive reasons. They found positive group identity, they found a familial brotherhood or sisterhood, they found spiritual enlightenment, they found purpose, they were sold a dream that they could make the world a better place. Extremist groups take all the nuance and difficulty of the world and war and they simplify it and they tell you, well, it's okay, you're not crazy. This is what's bad and this is what's good and you can be part of what's good. It looks a lot like Soviet propaganda. It looks a lot like Nazi propaganda. We should not pinhole Daesh propaganda as looking so different than these other things. It's very, very similar. So that's really sad because these people are looking for positive things. And this is where we have a multitude of areas for alternatives, whether that's rechanneling through programs that give them better internships with amazing humanitarian organizations that are doing good in the world. And this is not just hippy-dippy. This is actually when prevention is done well, you get communities that do not lead down this pathway. The perception of disenfranchisement and oppression is more potent than the reality of it. So when you looked at a lot of the foreign terrorist fighter case studies in the UK, you were not looking at the poorest, most in need parts of society. You were often looking at people that had decent education. Some of the women that left had PhDs. I followed the case of a female that started her own practitioner unit in Syria because they didn't have English language speakers to help deliver babies. That's not an unintelligent woman and that's not somebody that didn't have opportunities. So we have to be creative. We have to have a multitude of arenas to engage with people. We have to go to base grievances. This is just one piece of the problem. Then there's the side with what do you do when people are already engaged? How do we disengage somebody that already has a swastika tattoo, that's already sharing bomb-making materials? That's a very different profile than trying to create resiliency among young people. And the evaluation of how to help those two different groups is very different. So the answer is not simple. We need to allow for the complexity and not be extremist with how we define extremism. We have to realize that it's going to take a multitude of sectors working together.
Thank you for the question. Thank you, Aaron. I think you covered that. A question here. There's a mic there on the table. Your name and organization to start.
Okay, Jeff Payne. All right, Jeff Payne with the NISA Center in Washington, D.C. This is more oriented towards a technological question. Forgive the kind of hostility implicit in the question, but I figured why beat around the issue. It's clear that Facebook, Twitter, a lot of other major social media companies are doing a lot to deal with the issue of CT, CVE, radicalization, but admittedly by the executives of these companies, it's a consistent catch-up game that they're not necessarily always winning or doing correctly and learning as they go. What do you say to the response where part of the problem is the scale of these institutions, and there needs to be greater regulation put upon them? I mean, this is something that is very openly discussed in Washington. So what's your reaction, not in terms of discussions about voters and everything like that, but the issue of radicalization as it comes to potential terrorism issues?
Colin, you can come in on this one too if you really want.
I'll definitely chime in.
Yeah. Okay, so I will thank you for throwing out a hard one. It's always good. We can also follow up afterwards if I don't answer it as fully as you want. But on the question of winning and learning, very unfortunately, none of us learn from winning as much as we do from our failures. And so the point, though, is that we learn. So we have to learn as mistakes are made. Scale is part of it. I can name you 100 other platforms that aren't very big that are also exploited by bad entities, many of which we've worked at and worked with. The other issue is the diversity of the online space. So when we talk about the need for regulation, regulation is a net neutral word. It really depends on what that looks like and the unintended consequences regulation can be a very positive thing. So legislation that gives us better guidelines, that helps us define in black and white terms what illegal content is, that engages with us on where to draw the line, is actually sometimes very helpful. It sometimes can be very hurtful if it doesn't understand the online space. So regulation or legislation made without understanding the Internet of Things can have very bad consequences, or just not understand how it's going to be effective in helping that. So it really depends what that looks like. We talk with governments all the time. When we talk about terrorism, there's no agreed upon definition by nation states. So the UN countries do not have an agreed upon definition. Even within the EU, lists look very different. So we're having to refer to some of these lists, but also make sure that if a country comes to us and requests for the takedown of a group, and we analyze and see that that's an opposition party or an activist network, that we push back on that. And one of the best things we can do is be transparent. So one of the best things we can do is admit when something goes wrong, show how we've learned from it, do annual, if not twice a year, transparency reports. It's one of the things when we made the Global Internet Forum to Counterterrorism that we made on a 6-point membership criteria. You can look at giftct.org, and one of the things we're holding all of our companies accountable to is making sure we have accountable transparency reports that talks about what governments request from us, how much we're compliant. These are not easy tasks. There's lots of lawyers in the room. It's not fun, but it's something that we have to do. And we are learning. So I do not come from a tech background. If you asked me 5 years ago and told me that I would work for a social media company, I would have laughed at you. My background is in radicalization and extremist groups and neo-Nazis and terrorists. This is very new that tech sector has specialist teams around terrorism or elections integrity, or makes sure that they have language support in Botswana if they need it. These are very new things. So part of it is size, and we're having to solve for that. Part of it is how do we be smart with the technology so it's not whack-a-mole. So I mentioned that we took down 14.3 million pieces last year. The context matters. The fact that our technology could go back in time and find content so it's retroactive as well as forward-looking is important. The fact that recidivism doesn't increase, that's not just whack-a-mole, that gets you ahead of a curve. But then, as I said, we have to talk with other technologies, and it's not just social media. We have to look at transportation technologies, financial technologies, blockchain. We look at encryption, because all of them can be exploited. I won't name and shame other platforms that we work with, but oftentimes they're just run by one person in another country, and the first time they get a government request for data, it's in a language they don't even speak, and they can't afford a lawyer. So some of the solves, the big solves are different for our companies than for the smaller companies, but I think we are learning. We're trying to learn together. Are we gonna make more mistakes? I'm sorry to say probably, because there are some unknown unknowns, but if we're working with other sectors and having those sectors give us better guidelines and holding ourselves accountable, we can get to a better space.
And I'll just add on top of that, those comments from Erin, that certainly if you look at it from a Twitter perspective, when I joined Twitter 7.5 years ago, Twitter was 140 characters and a link. And if you clicked on the link, it took you somewhere else. Now it's a platform that's far more media rich. It has photos, videos. You can live broadcast, right from your mobile phone. But also, in the same way that technologically Twitter is not the same as it was at the time of its inception, certainly our track record with respect to responding to terrorist content, violent threats on the platform is different. And so the Twitter of January 2019 is not the same as the Twitter of 2015, and how we respond to that. I mentioned some of the investments in machine learning to go after some of this content proactively, from basically using technology to help us solve some of the problems that technology itself poses at scale. The GIFT-CT dynamic that Erin mentioned, I think is a good example, because that is something that we developed in consultation with and communication with a variety of governments. And we do have meetings and updates that we share with governments around the world. We share and collaborate with our peer companies on a variety of different things. As we address some of this content and it migrates to other parts of the internet and other apps, Erin mentioned some of the hash sharing collaborations, but we have had a consortium of 10 other companies with whom Twitter works, where we share URLs that are being linked to on Twitter from the accounts that we're removing, that may be hosted elsewhere or similarly pointed to on other platforms, so that we're collaborating across industries, but particularly trying to get the knowledge to entities that might be used by millions of people, but don't have the in-house wherewithal to deal with it, perhaps because of resource issues. But I spent most of my adult life in government before joining Twitter. I don't approach the word regulation as if it's charged full of kryptonite. You can be sensible about how you approach it in ways that provide guidelines, and I think we'll certainly see proposals on a variety of different things in Washington, Brussels, and many other places on that. But there's also a risk of over-indexing, because you can put regulations on this where you can say, companies must remove content that is reported to them by governments within an hour. And in that kind of speed, the number of false positives that we might approach perhaps over-indexes to hurting some values that are important in a democracy. I will note, just parenthetically, that when we look at all of the content that we've removed for terrorist purposes on Twitter in the last 6-month reporting period, of all the reports that we got, only 0.1% of the reports came from government to us. So a lot of this work is work that we're doing ourselves. Any other questions? I know we're at about time. And the bar's open.
May I ask a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm very impressed with the account that has been given by both of you in defense of the social media. But my fundamental question remains is that why is it that law enforcement is finding it so difficult to get content in legitimate cases? Because notwithstanding whatever you said and whatever effort that you, admirable effort that you're making to bring down content, the issue remains is that law enforcement does find, even today, great difficulty in getting content for enforcing the law of their own countries. So how are you going to surmount that problem?
It's a good question. Thank you for taking advantage of the moment up here. I think it's very important, because when we talk about terrorism, to ignore law enforcement is naive, because we are talking about credible threat and real world harm. And this is something that, even if terrorist content on our platforms is 0.001% of any violating content, it has a much greater potential to cause real world harm than, let's say, spam or pornography. And I'm not the expert on spam or pornography, so I'll just speak to terrorism, but I know that some things with law enforcement, and we do talk with law enforcement all the time, we do give training to law enforcement all over the world. I will usually partner with one of our law enforcement internal agents to give a terrorist-specific context, but we'll train about how to report it, where those portals are, the best way to do it, if it's an expedited situation like a hostage situation or a credible threat situation, how to make sure we get that as quickly as possible. Sometimes it's not about content, usually it's about personal data that's being requested. And that's not something that we as tech companies can give over lightly. And we are also held to other types of legislation around privacy and surveillance. It's something we never want to withhold in the case of a real world emergency, but it's also nothing that we can give over without oversight. And so that's something that there are some legislative, to speak to your point, there are some legislative pieces on the table around e-privacy, around the Cloud Act, that are meant to try to expedite some of the ways that we can give data with human rights oversight and within legal structure. There's also the MLAT process, which is the Mutual Legal Assurance Treaty. We have frameworks we have to work under. And sometimes when it's an issue of getting someone's private email address or phone number, we have to have oversight to make sure that that's not going to be given over and have something damaging happen to somebody that might or might not be a criminal or might or might not be part of an investigation. So I am sorry to say that sometimes that does mean things take too long. We have to have our legal oversight, but we are supporting some of the legislation on the table that could expedite some of that. but not at the cost of other things. So I think one of the things this panel has expressed is we often have these three pillars that are in conflict with one another. And one of that is privacy, the other is security, and the other is voice and free speech. So if you solve for just one pillar, the other two are completely damaged. And drawing a line around privacy, security, and voice in a way that any one person or body agrees with is nigh on impossible, but it's something as tech companies that we are having to do through our terms of service and our community standards. I can follow up with you on the law enforcement stuff and make sure that in India, and I've got some of our public policy people that I will throw at you as well to make sure it's specific to here. But it's going to continue to be an issue as we grapple with those three pillars.
Great, thank you. Any other quick questions? No. Will you all please join me in thanking our panelists for this evening's discussion? Thank you all very much for participating.